Hello everyone, I'm Donald Murphy, Marketing Manager for NVIDIA's GPU Technology Conference, otherwise known as GTC, and I want to welcome everyone to GTC Express. GTC Express is a year-round extension of the great content available at GTC, providing insight and unique perspectives on GPU computing and GPU technologies from top scientists, researchers, developers, and industry practitioners. If you are new to GTC Express, welcome, and I encourage you to come back often and participate. It's my pleasure today to introduce Gianni De Fabritis and Matt Harvey from Acellera, who are joining us today from Barcelona. Along with being founder of Acellera, Gianni is Associate Professor of Bioinformatics for Health Sciences at Universitat Pompeu Fabra and the group leader at the Computational Biophysics Laboratory in the research unit on biomedical informatics within the new Barcelona Biomedical Research Park. He received his bachelor's degree in applied mathematics from the University of Bologna and his PhD in computational chemistry from Queen Mary University of London. Matt Harvey is the CTO of Acellera. He has degrees in astrophysics and information technology from the University College London. Matt has a decade of experience in the field of high-performance computing and also works for the HPC service at Imperial College London. Today they will share presentation responsibilities covering the topic of ACEMD, high-throughput molecular dynamics with NVIDIA Kepler GPUs. You're welcome to submit your questions at any point during the presentation by typing them in the area provided on your screen, and we'll endeavor to answer them as we go along. At the very least, we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. We will be recording this webinar and making it available for download on the GTC website, as well as a PDF copy of the slides. But before we get started, I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that GPUs are becoming a true standard in computational chemistry. As of now, key codes in molecular dynamics and quantum chemistry are GPU accelerated, and there are even several codes that run only on GPUs. The slide that you currently see on your screen covers only a small portion of the GPU accelerated codes that are available, and you can check out the full list of apps we've compiled on the NVIDIA website at nvidia.com/TeslaApps. So advancing to the next slide, there is a tool that you can actually get started with GPUs. NVIDIA, together with its partners, has built a set of GPU clusters around the world for you to try the latest Tesla GPUs. All of the clusters have ACEMD pre-installed and will give access to 4 K20 GPUs. The clusters are accessible remotely and easy to try. All you need to do is sign up for a free GPU test drive, upload your models, run ACEMD, and see the results for yourself. And to register for a GPU test drive, the link is nvidia.com/GPU test drive. So with that, I want to welcome Gianni and Matt.
Hi, thanks. Thanks everybody for joining us. So I'll be speaking for the first half of the presentation, and Matt is going to go through the second half of the presentation. First half is more on what you can do with MD these days and how you can exploit GPUs to run high throughput simulations, so very many simulations to get your results, your science done. The second part is more on the technical part, how to use it and how to use all the features of ACEMD and the new feature we are announcing as well. Okay, let's go first. One point I'd like to stress is, okay, we're doing MD because we're trying to model biology, and there are certain scales in biology which can be covered easily, like for instance bond vibration or side chain rotation, for instance down here, which goes in time scale of the order 1 picosecond, 1 nanoseconds. But if you take that and you run on a GPU, an MD GPU code, it can take you from 1 to 1,000 seconds to resolve these scales. If you look at more interesting phenomena like loop motions, then this takes of the order of 1 nanosecond to 1 microseconds. So you actually have to wait between 10 minutes and 10 days to at least being able to reach and see the event. And if you go to more complex scenario where you have, for instance, allosteric modulation molecular recognition, so binding, the process of binding. This is, let's say that is between 1 microsecond and 1 millisecond. And this goes between 10 days and 30 years. So this is already beyond really, if you use a single GPU, so it's already beyond what you can do these days now. So, however, if you have a cluster of 100 GPUs, and you assume that you can actually have a scheme, you have a way of doing this simulation, such as by running 100 of this simulation, you actually get the same sort of time scale. Then the same 1 microsecond to 1 millisecond, you can actually resolve it between hours to months. Okay, so actually this becomes feasible, and that's what we've been working a lot in these last years to be able to, using such clusters, to be able to resolve the process of binding in silico. Okay, so that's why in this paper we were actually justifying the fact that the high throughput molecular dynamics, the powerful new tool for drug discovery, because molecular dynamics was not being used that much in drug discovery before, but we think now we are in a stage where you can start to do several things. And there's a couple of paradigms in which people were using molecular dynamics. The standard one, the one you used to, is you run a single or a few simulations, maybe very long. These days, very long in GPUs on a CPU cluster is actually several microseconds, and if you use some special hardware, it could be even milliseconds. So you can reach this time scale of several milliseconds, but or actually from 1 microseconds to milliseconds, depending on the hardware. And the best system actually to do these sort of things, like if you really want to go as fast as possible, it's probably Anton, if you know about this specialized machine, but also Desmond on CPU. So even a CPU cluster can actually reach a higher performance than GPUs. What it doesn't do is it does it at an extreme price. Because, for instance, you can have the performance in a single GPU with ACEMD, you can have the same performance on 300 nodes on Desmond. And you might use 400 nodes and go even faster. So the point is not to go faster, but really to be cost effective when you run. And that's the second mode of running that is the one we propose and we use. So we run very many runs of reasonable length. So let's say from 50 to 100 nanoseconds, depending on the process. Even 10 nanoseconds could be enough, but let's say reasonably between 50 and 500 nanoseconds each run. And we can run thousands of those. So we reach simulation times which is of several milliseconds, so comparable of what you can get on the left, even with Anton. And the best system for this is actually GPUs. Because GPUs, in a single GPU, gives almost the performance of an entire cluster. And so you can get many of those, and so you have a very cost-effective systems. And we've been, the main project exploiting these things is GPU grids in Folding at Home, for instance. A true project, GPU grid, is led by us, Folding at Home by Vijay Pandey, and it's what is taking this to the limit. So we use several thousand GPUs from users around the globe to try to experiment on this sort of protocols. The main difference between these two is in the analysis. So if you have a single run, it's a bit easier to analyze. You still have a lot of data. But if you have these very many runs, then the analysis becomes more complex. So this is also what we're working on. So let me give you an example, 3 examples actually of binding process and what you can do when you have many simulations. So we run here very many simulations of trypsin, the protein trypsin with benzamidine. Now we overimposed here 5 different trajectories. So each simulation were run with a single ligand, but we are overimposing 5 trajectories. And you see that sometimes the ligand come in contact with the protein, and then eventually mature into the binding pocket. Okay? And this was one simulation of the many, and then in another case it goes to the same similar binding, metastable binding site or preliminary binding site, but then it doesn't actually manage to mature into the binding pocket. Remember, the red one is not there. Each simulation is run independently. Okay, so in this case, we see already that the standard binding process that we usually consider, so that we go from A to B to the complex, A, B, even in this simple system with very rigid protein, is something a bit more complex when you have an intermediate states, preliminary binding site. And this preliminary binding site has actually been recovered in another simulation of this kind in another simulation of these kinds in the past. This is a bit more of a complex case. In this case, everything is flexible. The protein is flexible. The ligand is flexible. And again, this one is a few simulations of a tetrapeptide, PYEII, and bound into an ACES2. And you see immediately that it forms an intermediate complex where the phosphatidylate bind to the surface of the protein. Here, color stands for flexibility. So it's kind of a running average LMSF. So red is more flexible, blue is more rigid. So you see that while the ligand is binding, then the protein becomes more blue, so more rigid. There is this loop up here that actually has to open in order for the hydrophobic part of the ligand to bind. Until this opens, the ligand keeps searching for conformation but can't find the right pocket. So now the pocket opened and the ligand can search its way into the binding site. Okay, so the final conformation actually is the left loop also has to close on top of it. There is the final conformation was actually within a few Armstrong RMSD from the crystal structure in this case. And also the estimation of the K-on was very good compared to experiments. So this is one case where you can really do even this flexible ligand. You see at the end when this ligand is very bound, then all the protein is becoming more blue, is paying a cost for binding conformational entropy, and it's and this is the last slide. Another thing that you can do is actually binding through the membrane. In this case, it's an enzyme, and the substrate is lipid-like and lives in the membrane and has to enter through. He has to enter through the membrane. So in this case, the catalytic pocket is actually inside the protein, and the ligand has to enter through the binding through the inside of the protein. This we're showing only one. There is a standard concentration of anandamide in the membrane, and there is water, membrane, everything. Just showing one part. So we don't have a crystal structure to compare it with, but it gets to a pose which is very, very similar, very close to the pose of a known inhibitor for this system. Okay, so let me go a bit more in detail or what we have been able to do, especially for in-silico ligand binding or in-silico binding assays, as we call it. So the idea is to actually treat a computer like a measurement machine, so like an assay, an appliance. So you give a protein and a ligand, and you want to measure several properties, thermodynamic and kinetic properties of this binding process. And actually in this, we realized that for trypsin-benzamidine we could do it. And this is the first case you saw it. And so it's a system of 35,000 atoms of 500 trajectory. And we run 100 nanoseconds each, so we have something like 50 microseconds of data. So assuming a very simple kinetic process of this sort, we could do an analysis which is based in microstate model. I'm not talking about this here, but you can read in the paper. And we can actually measure the K-on and K-off for this process, as well as the binding affinity. And so we recover a K-on, which is I think a factor 5 off compared to the binding to the experimental on rate, and a K-off which is a bit further down, within 15 times off compared to the rates measured by experiments. A factor 10 in this case is considered quite good for these scales. Another interesting effect you already saw in the first movie. So for this simple system, we're actually expecting the ligand to go straight in the binding pocket, but we didn't see that. We saw that the main pathway of entry, or one of the main pathway of entry, is through this rolling of the ligand through the surface, through this channel here, and entry into the binding pocket. And interesting enough, so we actually predicted a couple of, apart from the binding pocket, we predicted this side binding pocket, and the side binding pose, and another binding pose on the left of the ligand, so which here is called X1 and X2. The crystallographer from France he came 3 months later and told us that he actually managed to recover these sites, and he actually recovered more than those using a special technique by using high pressure and low temperature, and to recover also states which are not above, which have occupancy less than 10%. In this case, so we found the 2 states that we find, but also several others. And so we went on and we tried now to validate these other states to see if they're due to crystal packing, to high pressure, or if they might be real. Okay, so this was one first example of what you can do for a simple system. So what we decided to do later is that, well, we can actually do many of these ligands and apply in silico a fragment-based drug design approach. In a fragment-based drug design approach, you take several small molecules which form fragments on which you start to build your drug afterwards. So it's different from virtual screening or Metrocubo screening, where you actually try to get full drugs out altogether. Here you take a small fragment. And we looked at this paper, which was interesting because it was, it's an old paper from 2003 for factor 10A. It was trying to demonstrate the use of fragment-based drug discovery by NMR, so entirely experimental. And these are the 2 pockets that they were trying to target. So they built a library of 34 compounds, and they screened based on the NMR. And they say that 9 of these compounds actually bind. And this is all experimental. And they report 4 of those, which they selected as best ligands. Interesting enough, among these compounds, these 34 compounds were chosen for different reasons. Some because they were drug-like, but have nothing to do with the protein. But some because they were taken from known inhibitors of the protein. Okay, so they were like broken part of known inhibitors. So what the idea was, can we recover this by NMR? They didn't have a way to see, so they didn't use 2D NMR, so they didn't have a way to see where the ligands were binding, so they used a competition assay based on this other ligand that they knew where it was binding, to see where the ligands, to try to guess where the ligands were binding after all. So they predicted, for instance, for ligand 31, which this is the 4 ligands then selected, they predicted pose in S4, in the site S4, in the site S1, S4 core, and so on and so forth, based on the fact that there was displacement or not in the competition assay. So we ended up doing these things, was actually a couple of years ago already. So we took 34 ligands, and we simulated the entire systems, and we did that by doing 1,000 replica of 50 nanoseconds for each of the ligands. Okay, so it's 34 by 1,000 by 50, which is something like 1.8 milliseconds of data. All of this run in GPU rate, of course. And we applied this analysis, which again I'm skipping here, and these are the 4 ligands that they selected and the poses that we can determine. Okay, this is a sort of output that you get from the analysis. But let's look at it a bit more in detail. I hope you can see this. So we can practically take the best pose for every ligand and compute all the kinetics data, K on and K off, for each pose. And by doing this, we can do that for the best pose, but we can do that for other poses, for all the poses that we identify in the surface of the protein. So one way to rank it is by residence time, and one way to rank it is by delta G, by free energy. In this case, we rank it by delta G, and you see that the 4 ligands are well within the 9 ligands that they claim are binding. And let's, for each of these ligands, we have a measure of KD, residence time in the pose, which is the same, inverse of that, inverse of K off, so K off, K on, and delta G. So let's look a little bit more in detail for ligand 27. So the experimentally was said that it was weakly displaced by TPAM, so they didn't really know where it was going, and what I had hypothesized to bind at S4, and by similarity with another compound. And for us, it binds at the core part of the cavity and the entrance of S1. So this is where we're supposed to bind compared to what they say. This is one example, one movie, where you see again what sort of data we analyze when we do this. In this case, it's a stable plot. So the plots on the left, one is, so the first one, it practically tells us if the simulations, the analysis is converged. And the second is, for every pose, we report the free energies. And the third one, for every pose, we report the residence time or the inverse of the K off. So in this case, you see that there is only one pose which has a significant residence time of around 80 micro. We do the same for all of them. So and for ligand 10 was clearly displaced by TPAM, and this was predicted to be in S4, and we also found it to bind on S4. For ligand 29 was predicted to bind, was displaced by TPAM, was hypothesized to bind an S1 pocket by similarity with on. And we say that we also find it binds on this pocket S1. For ligand 31 was failing to be displaced by TPAM and expected to bind on S1, and we find that it binds between the loops between S1 and S4. One interesting thing for how, so we cannot really do the competition assay, so what we did was to overimpose the trajectory of binding, or we also simulated TPAM, the competitor, and this kind of gives you an idea why the competition assay would give the different binding. So the pocket where they go is all the same, and so TPAM should be able to displace several of these ligands. Okay, so here is the end of the first part, and we are now on the second part, where Matt will speak mostly about the methods.
Thank you. I should say, Johnny is now having to leave, so I won't be around to be able to answer questions offline, so I'll take all questions at the end. So I'm going to talk now a bit more about the hardware and the methods and the technology that we have for supporting these high-throughput molecular dynamics simulations. In particular, ACEMD, which is the molecular dynamics code which we use for all of these simulations. But first, to give you the background, ACEMD came out of a research project which we had around 2006, when we were exploring the use of the then new heterogeneous processors for scientific computing, particularly for particle simulations. And based on the conclusions of that project, we made this prediction in this 2008 paper that sometime in the next 5 years, the rate of progress of development of these processes would mean that we could routinely access timescales of biological interest using MD. And I hope Johnny has convinced you that that's something which is indeed now possible. But going back to 2006, we started using the first, what was, I suppose, the first mass market heterogeneous processor, which was the cell processor from IBM. We developed a proof of concept code called CellMD, which we ran on the cell processor, which we found in the PlayStation 3 games console. And that code ran almost 20 times faster than comparable CPU codes running on the single-core CPUs of the day. However, although the cell processor was very interesting technically, games consoles have a very, very long product cycle life, so very rapidly they became something which were no longer interesting technically from, at least from the scientific simulation perspective. But about 2007, NVIDIA released the first GPUs which were fully programmable and useful for non-trivial scientific simulation. And thanks to the superb CUDA programming language which they produced to support these GPUs, we were able to get an MD code running on this hardware very quickly, and the first version of ACEMD was available in 2007. And from the get-go, because we developed ACEMD specifically for this hardware, this was the first MD code which was fully GPU accelerated, which is to say every aspect of the MD simulation happened on the GPU. The CPU was just there along for the ride, just there to support the execution of the GPU code. So the performance was entirely gated by the GPU. In order to make a production quality MD code, we had to implement the particle mesh EROR algorithm, which is used for calculating the long-range contribution to the electrostatics. And that's a sine qua non for making production quality MD code, as distinguished from just a toy or proof of concept code. You can read a bit more about the technology behind ACEMD in this paper from 2009 in JCTC. So the capabilities that ACEMD has now are all of the features that you would expect to find in any other production MD code for biomolecular simulation. It supports all of the common force fields, charm, amber, OPLS, and Martini for force grain, along with the common file formats, PDB and NAMD, VMD, binary coordinates, the force field files produced by TLEAP from Amber Tools, and Charm GUI, ESFs, and INT files, and submits trajectories in DCD and XDC format, so they'll be eaten by your favorite analysis program. As well as supporting PME for the electrostatics, we support generalized reaction field if you want to use that. And we can simulate in the commonly used ensembles, MBE, isothermal, isobaric, for which we have Langevin thermostats and the Berenson ballast stat. In addition, there are support for the constraints and holonomic constraints like shape, which you would use to increase the time step of the simulation. And if your needs for biasing a simulation go beyond simple constraints, then we have very powerful scripting and programming extension capabilities, which I'll go into in a few slides. If you are interested in replica exchange methods, then we support multi-host execution so that you can run this code as an ensemble on a large GPU cluster. And lastly, the distribution of ACEMD is binary, so you download it and you run it. You don't need to faff about compiling. It's very straightforward. To support using ACEMD, well, we have all of the documentation that you would expect. We've got user manuals, good documentation for covering the development of plugins and extensions, manuals for protocols, which you can think of as recipes or guides for doing routine but nevertheless quite involved processes like building a system and performing an equilibration. If you need support, then there's a Google group, and if you're a paid customer, then we have a direct email support. Furthermore, if you have the need to develop some sort of plugin or extension but don't have the wherewithal to do that in-house, then usually we can do that sort of development for you and contribute the plugin back to the community so other people can use it. We have a couple of ways of delivering ACEMD as well. We have our own hardware appliance, a customized workstation called Metrocubo, which I'll describe in a moment, and our new offering, which is our cloud offering, which we hope will be a way that to allow people to take advantage of the high throughput methods that Johnny talked about earlier. Looking at the performance of ACEMD now, the design goal for ACEMD has always been to produce a a code which has the fastest possible performance on a single GPU. And if you look at the chart on the right, you'll see the performance of ACEMD on a very commonly used benchmark model of dihydrofolate reductase, which is a shade under 24,000 atoms. And on the recent generations of NVIDIA hardware, there's a performance up to 230, 240 nanoseconds a day on the latest single GPUs, which is something that you would struggle to obtain economically on a CPU cluster even today. Now, the flip side of the performance being very, very good on one GPU is that the parallel scaling appears relatively poor, and that's a simple consequence of the GPU being so much faster, so much more bandwidth available on the GPU than there is on the interconnect that connects the GPU to the host system. And therefore, we see scaling factors of about 1.2, 1.3 on 2 GPUs, and 1.4 or so on 3 GPUs. And therefore, that's something that makes these high throughput methods increasingly relevant, because it's simply not possible to go on scaling on big clusters of GPUs if you care about strong scaling, which is to say you care about increasing the performance of a system of fixed size rather than being prepared to increase the size of your system as you increase the number of GPUs. Looking at the performance with GPUs, as I said, the performance scales linearly with the GPU speed, with the number of gigaflops per second of the GPU. And importantly, you simply don't need a fast CPU in order to run ACEMD. All of the performance stems from the GPU. Normally, if you're running unbiased simulations, the CPU, the performance of the CPU is not very important. So if you're spending money buying GPU resources, you can put all of your money into GPUs and dial back the specification on the host systems. So ACEMD Basic is a free version of ACEMD, which is perfect if you have a GPU machine and you want to start to experiment with ACEMD with your own simulations, and it's fine if your MD use is relatively light. It's a full function version of ACEMD, with the exception it only runs on a single GPU. You can visit the URL here to download it. So I said a few slides back that ACEMD can be extended, and there are two ways which we support for doing this. The first is a scripting method using the scripting language TCL, which if you're already a NAMD user, you will find very, very familiar. It's very straightforward once you've learned scripting language, and it's perfect for doing very quick modifications to a simulation. For example, applying very simple constraints to point atoms, or to restrain the center of mass of some object, or for changing the state of the simulation, for example, changing the temperature to a near the system. The downside is that it's very slow if you need to do something numerical, and furthermore, if you've already developed some biasing code for some other MD engine, say, or for your own project, then it's very difficult to interface that to TCL, which is why we have a more powerful interface, which we term a plug-in interface, and this allows you to write something in C or C++ and interface that directly to ACEMD at runtime, and you have access to very many more features, much more control over the simulation, and yet it's still very straightforward. So if you have, if you're writing something very complex, or you have an existing third-party code that you want to interface with, then this is the way to go. The very popular metadynamics code, BlueMed, for example, was interfaced with ACEMD in barely a morning's work, and the testing then proceeded almost straight away that day. So the programming model, as I said, ACEMD is a binary application, which means that you don't get the source code to grub around in, which may initially seem like a disadvantage, but in fact, if you're goal-oriented and want to implement a feature in a particular MD code, then you may find it very, very difficult to get to terms with the code and understand exactly how to modify these things in order to achieve your goals. So we enforce a very clear and clean separation between ACEMD and the interface that the extension that you're making, and makes it much cleaner, so you know exactly what the actions that you're performing are, and you can be sure that there are no unintended side effects from your modification. And the programming model is, broadly speaking, it's an event-based one, and there are 4 events that you need to deal with when you're writing code. The first 2 are very straightforward. They're initialize and termination events, which happen once every simulation at the beginning, at the end, so that you can initialize the state of your extension and then clear a path to yourself at the end. And then there are 2 other events, calc forces, which happens every iteration during the force evaluation, so that you can calculate and apply a biasing force to the system however you wish. And then end step, which happens at the end of every iteration, which allows you to modify the more basic properties of the simulation. So here's an example. I'll whiz through this quickly. This is an example of doing temperature annealing in TCL. And on the right-hand side, this is the tickle that you would put in the input file of your simulation. And first 3 lines set up the state of the Langevin, the thermostat, setting an initial temperature of 0. Here we set the annealing profile variables that cover that. In this case, we're going to start from the temperature of 0, ramp it up to 310 Kelvin in steps of 10 Kelvin every 2,500 steps. This is the handler for the initialization event. In this case, we don't need to do anything. And this is the handler for the calc forces event. Here we calculate what the target temperature should be for the current step. This is called every iteration. Here we reset the target point for the Langevin, and here we decide whether the target temperature, the final target temperature, has been reached, in which case we stop making any further applications. And that's it. That's all you need to do. Now, if you wish to implement that in a plugin, things are slightly more involved. This is the full plugin. This is all you would need to write in C in order to accomplish the same thing. In fact, strictly speaking, it's slightly more than you would need to write. Here, this ACEplug init is the code that deals with the initialization. Here we need to do a bit of work because we're going to pass parameters from the input file into the code at runtime, so we need to be able to parse those, and all of the arguments that you pass to a plugin are passed as key value pairs. So here we're extracting the start temperature, the step, the end temperature, and the iteration interval, putting them into variables. And then here, again, here's the handler for calc forces, which does the reset of the temperature, the target temperature, by calling this function plugin set temperature. So as you can see, it's very straightforward. In order to use it, you have to go through because it's C code, it has to be compiled, so it's compiled as a shared library. It's a single line to do, it's very straightforward. Then in the input file, you use these 3 commands, plugin load, in which you specify the file name of the plugin that you built. You give it a handle so that you can refer to it later, and then you specify the arguments that you've made for the plugin tstart, tstep, tend, interval. And finally, plugin frequency allows you to set the interval, iteration interval between successive calls of calc forces. Usually you would set this to leave it at the default 1. I include it there to illustrate it. So this means that you can very easily use a plugin developed by a third party if it's, for example, distributed as a DSO. So this is how we distribute FluMed along with ACEMD. It comes as a DSO, so you would load it like this and then use it as you would use FluMed with any other code. So looking now at the hardware that we support, we produce our own workstation, which we term Metrocubo, and it's a cost-optimized system, which is optimized for best performance of ACEMD on lowest cost system. As I said earlier, we seldom need high CPU performance, so we choose a single socket CPU, which nevertheless has 4 cores and is very powerful, which means that if you are using BlueMed, then you get the best possible performance out of that single-threaded code. And furthermore, this machine supports 4 GPUs, which is something quite unusual and quite rare in many workstation class machines. They simply won't support more than 3. The chassis, which we custom designed for the task, is very compact and very quiet, and it makes it suitable both as a machine to go under the desk, and also if your needs start to grow, then because they're so small, they're very conveniently rack mountable as well, so you can start with one and maybe start to put together a cluster in the future. And this, as I said, provides absolutely the best price performance for ACEMD and indeed for other fully GPU accelerated codes, particularly ND codes. If you wish to try out ACEMD on a Metrocubo, then as well as the coming in through the NVIDIA test drive program, we have our own test drive program, which will mean we'll give you 1 week of access to a 4 GPU Metrocubo with ACEMD, which is ample time for porting some of your existing simulations if you're doing any or setting up new models. And during that time, we'll give you expert support to help you with any problems that you might encounter. You visit the URL at the bottom if you should sign up for that. So if you don't have the resources in-house to buy your own machines, or you simply don't have the space to run a cluster or the systems administration support to buy one, procure one, and run one, then our new product, which we call ACECloud, is a way of running ACEMD on cloud resources. But it's much more than just making a virtual cluster in Amazon EC2 or having SSH into our own cluster. We've built a user interface which is really designed to facilitate high throughput molecular dynamics calculations. We use it exclusively in-house now with GPGrid. One doesn't have to think about queuing systems or copying files. There's a simple command line interface that makes it as easy to run ACEMD on the cloud as it is to run ACEMD locally on your workstation. And it's, as I said, it's designed for managing transparently large numbers of jobs, and also it's designed to support many users, so it's easy to manage a whole research group using a single account. So if you're interested in that, please contact us at info@acellera.com. I'll give you a flavor of what the user interface is like now. Running a simulation is as simple as running the client ACECloud run input file. In comparison, running ACEMD locally, you would do something like ACEMD input file. It's very straightforward. This client does all of the heavy lifting of parsing the input file, copying the files over to the cloud, and running the task. When you to refer to the task in the future, when you don't need to write down a Q sub ID or a job identifier, you get to use your own identifiers, which have this form project task, so that you can group together simulations under a single identifier, the project, which is absolutely essential if you're dealing with thousands of simulations, for example. Then here we have a way of viewing the status of your personal cloud. All the jobs are grouped here by project, showing the number that you have running, how far they are from completion, and the resources that you have available to you. To retrieve the files, you run a daemon in the background, which you can think of as a lot like Dropbox. It will retrieve the results back from the cloud into a directory on your machine as soon as they're available. So you don't have to wait for a simulation to finish before you see the results, and you certainly don't have to do an FTP or an SCP to copy files. And lastly, as Gianni said earlier when he was talking about fragment-based drug design, we are starting to offer as a turnkey service in-silico binding assays, in which we will take from you protein targets or a set of protein targets and a library of interesting fragments and perform for you the full end-to-end in-silico screening that he described, and as a result we will return quantitative estimates of binding pathways, delta G's of binding poses, and binding kinetics. If you're interested in this, again, please contact us at info@acellera.com. And finally, if anything that Gianni and I have spoken about today has been interesting to you, and I sincerely hope it has been, we are running a workshop in Barcelona in November, where we'll be going into the scientific and technical aspects of these high throughput methods in much more detail. And registration is open now, and the place is still available, and I very much hope to see you there. So thank you very much, everyone, for your attention. Please, if there are any questions, I'll take them now.
Great, Matt. Thanks so much. We do have quite a few questions that have come in, and again, to attendees, you are able to ask questions by using the question panel available to you. So please submit them at this time. So the first few questions, Matt, relate back to Gianni's portion of the presentation. So I'll take the questions in order that they came in. So
would you like to read them out?
Say that again?
Would you like to read them out?
Yes, yes, I will. So first question is roughly how large KB, GB, TB are the samples that Gianni referred to?
Okay, so well, that rather depends on the sampling frequency of each individual simulation, of course the number of simulations that you performed. I think that question was asked during the SH2 or the benzamidine trypsin slides. So the answer is, during those studies we generated some terabytes of data.
Okay.
Next question.
Then next question is, what kind of dynamics is used? NVE, NVT, etc.
Okay, so we support ACEMD supports simulation in the constant energy NVE ensemble, the isothermal NVT ensemble, and the isothermal isobaric or NPT ensemble.
And how do you choose the number of trajectories to compute?
Now that is involved. Broadly speaking, and it's a bit too involved to go into in detail here, but it stems from performing an error analysis of on the results of the analysis and determining when convergence to an appropriate or satisfactory level of error has been reached. So it's something which is done iteratively.
And for MPT ensembles, do you support only Berendenson-Barrow?
That's correct, yes. Yes, Berendenson-Barrow stack.
And then I guess I'll read this verbatim. It says, what about the ligands parametrizations?
So all of the studies that Gianni discussed, with the exception of the membrane-based systems, were conducted using various versions of the amber force field. We parameterized the ligands with the GAF force field using anti-chamber from the amber tool suite. We have automatic tools for doing that, which makes it very straightforward to parameterize a large number of ligands rapidly.
And how well do simulations that use PME scale with multiple GPU nodes in ACEMD?
So I think that was asked just before I put the performance slide up, so that's probably, everyone probably knows that. The answer is that simulations, whether PME or not, typically don't scale past about 1.4 times the performance of a single GPU on 3 GPUs, and those 3 GPUs all have to be on the same host. Well, that doesn't sound very impressive, but it's just a side effect of the GPUs being so very fast and good at doing MD. that as soon as one starts to decompose that task over multiple GPUs, the overhead of the communication really causes the performance to take a big hit, and that's because there's so much more bandwidth available on the GPU than there is on the even PCI Express 3 interconnects between the GPUs. I'd love to see that change in the future, but the technology roadmaps, as I understand it, mean that that's going to continue to be much the same in the future. So that's really why these high throughput techniques are really important.
Maybe this question was answered given the photo of your system, but the question is, does ACEMD run BASIC run over GTX Titan?
ACEMD BASIC will run on Titans and 780s. We have not yet completed the qualification process of ACEMD for that new hardware, but we hope to do so very soon.
And can Fortran be used with this?
So if you're developing a plugin, yes, you certainly could use Fortran. If you're using Fortran 90, then you'd use the ISO-C bindings, and I think it should be very straightforward to do that.
And in the BASIC download, is a simulated annealing protocol available?
So the script that I showed as the simulated annealing example is available in our new plugin guide, which will be on the website very soon. To call that a protocol is stretching things a bit. That was an example of how to use the interface. You probably would do the annealing in a slightly more sophisticated way. If there's interest in having a proper protocol for that, then yes, we'll put something together.
A attendee asks, why not a Python-based plugin? Many TCL systems have moved into Python.
Well, maybe they have moved to using Python now, but back when we developed ACEMD, scripting MD simulations really meant using NAMD, and our interface is basically compatible with the NAMD, with with the NAMD TCL API. So if you've done any scripting with NAMD, then using ACEMD is a doddle. And as for using Python, well, it's not really clear that Python has a place between the TCL interface and the higher performance C interface that we have. Many of our users are very happy with the plugin interface. If, however, you, for some reason, you wish to bolt a Python interpreter onto ACEMD, then I imagine it would be relatively straightforward to do so by making Python bindings for the API, the plugin API.
How long or fast does it usually take to finish ligand binding simulation?
So how long is a piece of string? So the study that Gianni discussed in great depth, the benzamidine trypsin system, was our prototypical system, and that had somewhat in excess of a millisecond of simulation data. That took a few months to do on GPU grid. Things are much more efficient now. We have a better handle on how much simulation is minimally required, and of course the GPUs are faster. So we would expect to turn around, say, a study of 30 fragments on one protein in a few months, in a couple of months, including analysis.
Is it easy to do coarse graining with ACEMD?
Yeah, you can use the Martini force field. If you get the Martini parameters in charm format, which you can get from the, I think they're on our website, and if you follow the NAMD Martini tutorial, then you'll get them there as well. That will work. That said, ACEMD is not optimized for coarse-grained systems. Coarse-grained systems have, of course, have a different particle density, and in order to be as fast as it is, ACEMD makes a few assumptions about the average density of systems. So performance is not as fast yet as it could be, as relatively small number of users use Martini. If there's strong interest in it, then of course we'll improve performance. It's not something that we, there's a distinction between features that we support and features that we support and make go fast, and Martini is in the former category.
Attendee asks, how does it work for larger systems, for example, in the 100,000 to 200,000 atom range?
In terms of performance, well, as I said, the performance scales approximately inversely proportionate to the number of atoms in the system. Up to 200,000 is, I would say, 100,000 to 300,000 is the sweet spot for ACEMD. That's a good size for most globular proteins in solvent or something in a membrane. That's our design point, if you will. Anything larger, up to 1 million atoms, we support, but much larger, and it's difficult to understand the scientific rationale for doing simulations using MD on such large systems.
Do you compress the result simulations? And if yes, attendee asks, can you tell me what methods do you use?
Yes, we use the very nice XTC file format, which the GROMACS guys developed, and that cuts down trajectory sizes by about 50% over DCD.
And there are a number of questions that have come in about the cost of the Metrocubo system. I don't know if your website speaks to that, or if you can help attendees.
Yes, contact us through the website, and we'll talk about prices, and we can give you a quotation very easily.
And one attendee based in India asks, is it available for purchase in India?
Software, yes, certainly. Software is available internationally.
Attendee asks,
We don't have a hardware partner in India.
Attendee asks, is it possible for you to discuss the relative performance of ACEMD versus other open source programs such as WhoMD and NAMD?
Well, there are lots of other MD codes, and almost all of them occupy different points in the possible design space. For example, it's not strictly fair to make a comparison between ACEMD and NAMD, because ACEMD is much faster on a single GPU than NAMD. But NAMD isn't designed to go fast on GPUs. NAMD is designed to go very fast on very large clusters, and to simulate very large systems, and at that it does very well. So if you have access to Titan, the real Titan system that is, then NAMD is the code for you to use there. If you've got a GPU workstation under your desk, then ACEMD is the code for that system. And WhoMD, well, WhoMD, I think WhoMD was at least originally designed for, not really for biomolecular systems. So, well, I haven't looked at it for a while, but I know that when it was first developed, it didn't have support for the charm and amber force fields, which of course are very essential if you're doing biomolecular simulation. And furthermore, it was a library which you need to control directly from scripting. So if your needs are very straightforward, you can't just download it and run it as binaries you can with ACEMD. So.
What kind of PBC do you support?
Fully periodic.
And is it possible to simultaneously run more than one simulation on a single GPU? And
yes, you certainly can do that. The new Kepler GPUs are designed to allow multiple programs to run on a GPU at the same time without there being a performance hit. If you've got the older Fermi cards like a 2090, say, or a GTX 580, then there's a definite performance hit by having two programs running on the card at the same time. with the Keplers, that's not so. What limits the number of jobs that you can put on the GPU is the amount of memory that's available on the card, of course. You'll reach a point where the card runs out of memory, and so one of the ACEMDs, you can't run another ACEMD, or you have just enough memory to allow ACEMD to go into a low memory mode, which reduces performance somewhat, but allows you to squeeze another simulation on. I hope that answers that question.
An attendee asks, in at least one of the papers, Gianni talked about PNAS being one of them. A low energy well is centered on the binding site. How well would be the results? How well would the results be without it? And how do you correct the delta G and con-coff from this?
So in those simulations, or in that study, that was done entirely blind. In the simulations, there's no bias or there's no bias or reaction coordinate imposed on the system that makes assumptions about binding sites. That's completely free binding. The ligands were allowed to diffuse and interact with the protein only under the force of the force field. And these simulations were, what we demonstrated in that paper is the ability to recover the binding site. I hope that answers that question.
Attendee asks, Berendenson barostat doesn't really statistically sample the MP ensemble. Do you plan to incorporate other more robust MP schemes like Langevin piston?
It's something that we probably will do. However, we've done very extensive simulations of membrane systems using the Berenson barostat, and we're very happy, we're very confident that it's absolutely what you need to equilibrate that type of system. Maybe if you are doing some sort of pressure jump simulation, it might not do the job, and that's for example, that's quite a niche use of MD, which we'd like to be able to support in the future. So probably Berenson is on the roadmap. But the message is that, Langevin is on the roadmap, but Berenson is very, very capable and will almost certainly do the job for you.
And following up on the number of trajectories, the questioner asks, so what is the converge criteria used for the error analysis?
That gets relatively involved, but generally speaking, we look at the error on the kinetic rates, the K on and K off that result from the analysis, and we look at those for each individual pose that we've covered.
Can you speak to the differences between ACEMD Basic and ACEMD Pro?
Certainly. ACEMD Basic is the same as ACEMD Pro with the restriction that it will run only on the first GPU of one system.
And what free energy techniques do you use? How do you, I guess, how do you, I guess the question is, how do you convergence of free energy? The questioner, can be more specific.
So the broad technique that we use in the analysis of high throughput MD simulations is a Markov modeling technique. To really go into the details of that is a bit beyond the scope of this talk, but if you go to our website, then you will see links to various papers. There's a PNAS paper on benzamidine trypsin, which should read if you're interested in the methods.
And we have one final question, and that is, are you able to speak to the name of the MD algorithm that you're using?
The MD algorithm, I'm not quite sure what that is referring to. If it means the integrator, then it's a velocity relay integrator. The force fields are the the potentials that we implement are the potentials required for, well, the force fields we use, charm and amber, and then we have a particle mesh EWALD method for treatment of long-range electrostatics.
Actually, we've had one more question come in, which is, does the code support free space boundary conditions?
It does not, but you can, in effect, achieve that by judicious setting of the cell size to remove any possibility of a periodic interaction. Yeah, that's the way you do it. So in effect, yes, with a caveat in how in the implementation of it, yes, free space methods are supported. Sort of. It depends on, I don't know, it depends on the type of simulation that Mr. Krasny has in mind.
So in the consideration of time, that's all of the questions we do have time for this morning. As you can see on the slide there, if you do have follow-up questions for Matt or Gianni, you can write to info@acellera.com. And I do want to thank them both for their time today and for such a terrific presentation. Matt, if you could help me advance the slides. Again, as I already mentioned at the top of the webinar, we have recorded this presentation and we'll have it available for download on the GTC website in about a week or so, and probably have that PDF of the slide deck available in the next day or two, so you can check on the GTC website. So in closing, I wanted to briefly mention three things. One is, again, please sign up for the GPU test drive program at nvidia.com/GPU test drive, as well as remembering that Acellera has their own ACEMD test drive, so you can check that out too. Second, if you can advance the slide, Matt, is we do have quite a variety of upcoming webinars in the next few weeks. And the ones that you see right on that slide are just a small sample of the webinars that we have coming up. So be sure to register for the ones that are of most interest to you at gputechconf.com/GTC Express. And the final slide, call for submissions for GTC 2014 is now open, and we'd love to hear from you if you're doing innovative work with GPUs. GTC 2013 attracted over 3,000 people from 51 countries and featured 425 sessions across myriad topics and tracks. So it's a really terrific place to showcase the work that you're doing, and I encourage you to submit a proposal to talk if you're interested. The deadline is September 27th, and you can find the submission guidelines and criteria on the GTC website, and the URL is right there on the screen. So again, many thanks, Gianni and Matt, for your presentation today. Thanks to all of the attendees for joining us. I hope you can join us next time. And with that, take care and have a great day.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.